Atlanta, Georgia. What would you do if the system erased the person you loved most? The courtroom was cold and indifferent, a space where the weight of justice pressed heavily on those who dared to challenge it. Rows of spectators filled the benches, their whispers hushed under the stern gaze of the judge. The attorneys spoke in murmurs, flipping through stacks of paperwork that held more weight than the people they represented. The bailiff stood motionless, eyes surveying the room with a detached indifference. At the front, 12-year-old Isaiah Reynolds sat rigid, his small frame tense with defiance. His dark, brown eyes moved from one face to another, searching for someone, anyone, who would look at him, who would acknowledge the question burning inside him. But no one did. No one was looking for his mother. He felt anger coil inside him, the injustice of it all wrapping around his chest like a vice. Days had passed. No phone calls, no visits, no explanations. They had taken his mother, Angela Reynolds, a woman who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, and left him to navigate the foster system without a word of what had happened to her. He would not let them ignore him. Isaiah stood abruptly. The scrape of his chair against the polished floor drew the judge's attention, his brow furrowing at the sight of the boy breaking protocol. "Sit down, son," the bailiff warned, his voice sharp. Isaiah did not move. His voice cut through the courtroom, steady and unwavering. "Where's my mother? Where are you watching from? And what time is it?" The night Angela Reynolds disappeared was supposed to be like any other. She had just finished a long shift at the diner, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders as she drove home. But somewhere along the way, everything changed. She was pulled over for a minor traffic violation, a broken taillight, they said. A routine stop, nothing more. Or at least, that was what she had thought. The next morning, she was gone. No phone call, no record of bail, nothing. 12-year-old Isaiah Reynolds had been startled awake by the sound of officers at his door. Their expressions were unreadable as they informed him that his mother had been detained. Before he could process the words, social services had arrived, packing his belongings into a single duffel bag. They assured him it was temporary, that his mother would be back soon. But soon never came. Days turned into weeks. Each call he made was met with deflection or silence. Every visit to the station ended with the same rehearsed response: "The case is under investigation." Isaiah wasn't naive. Something was wrong. Something was being hidden. He had seen the news, read the headlines. A woman arrested for a crime she didn't commit. An innocent life swallowed by the cracks in a broken system. His mother wasn't the first, but he was determined to make sure she wouldn't be forgotten. At night, Isaiah lay awake in his foster home, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment leading up to her disappearance. There were no answers, only questions. He thought about the police officers' faces that night, the ones who took her away. Their expressions had been blank, almost rehearsed. They hadn't looked at him when they said she'd be back soon. They had just gone through the motions, as if they had done this 100 times before. And that terrified him. How many others had disappeared like this? How many had simply been erased, just like his mother? The only person who could give him the truth was the one sitting behind the bench, the judge presiding over her case. But even that road seemed blocked. Isaiah had tried to attend the hearings, but they had been delayed, rescheduled, buried in legal jargon that made no sense to him. It was as if they were keeping him just far enough away to ensure he never got the answers he needed. With every passing day, Isaiah's resolve hardened. If no one else was going to fight for her, he would. He would demand answers. He would stand before the very people who had erased his mother and make them see what they had done. He didn't care if they dismissed him, if they tried to turn him away. He wasn't leaving until someone listened. He would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Because Isaiah knew one thing for sure. His mother hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken, and he was going to find out why. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Lawyers whispered among themselves. Officers sat with arms crossed, and the audience filled the gallery with watchful eyes. It was a space designed to intimidate, to remind people like Isaiah that they did not belong here. But he was not afraid. Judge Robert Whitmore sat high above them all, his presence looming over the room. His reputation was well known. His harsh rulings disproportionately affected black defendants, and his decisions rarely left room for second chances. Isaiah sat quietly in the front row, his fists clenched in his lap. He listened as case after case was called, the voices of lawyers and defendants blending into a meaningless hum. He waited for his mother's name, for someone to acknowledge her, but the court moved on as if she had never existed. That was when Isaiah had enough. He stood up. Without hesitation, he marched toward the judge's bench, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. "Where is my mother?" he demanded. Gasps echoed through the room. The courtroom, once alive with murmurs, fell silent. The prosecutor turned sharply. The defense attorneys froze. The officers at the back of the room tensed. Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. His gavel slammed down. "Order in the court," he barked. But Isaiah did not back down. His voice rose, shaking with anger, but firm. "You locked her up. Now tell me where she is." The judge's expression darkened. "Sit down, boy. This is not how the system works." Isaiah felt the weight of those words. This was not how the system worked. Then how did it work? By making mothers disappear, by leaving children alone without a word, without an answer. His voice rang through the courtroom, louder than ever. "Then how does it work?" he challenged. "By making mothers disappear?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the reporters, poised with their notebooks and cameras, hesitated. The room, for once, had nothing to say. Isaiah stood tall, unflinching. He was not leaving without answers. And now, everyone in that courtroom knew it. The judge took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around his gavel. He looked toward the prosecutor, who shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. One of the officers at the back of the room shifted, glancing at his partner. There was something uneasy in his expression, something Isaiah caught immediately. He wasn't the only one who saw the cracks forming. "Your Honor," the prosecutor finally spoke, his voice forced into an even tone. "This outburst is highly inappropriate. This court has procedures." "Procedures," Isaiah cut in, his anger boiling over. "Like taking my mother away without a word? Like locking her up with no record? Those kinds of procedures?" The judge exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "That is enough. If you do not sit down, I will have you removed." Isaiah's heart pounded. He had come this far. He had forced them to listen. And he would not stop now. "Go ahead," he challenged, his voice unwavering. "Remove me. Throw me out. But you can't erase the truth." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A reporter at the front of the gallery stood clearing her throat. "Your Honor, is there any record of Angela Reynolds' arrest? Can the prosecution confirm her current location?" The prosecutor hesitated, his face paling. "The matter is sealed." Isaiah's stomach twisted. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud sent a wave of dread through him. "Sealed?" he repeated. or buried? The courtroom doors swung open. A court officer stepped inside and whispered into the bailiff's ear. The judge's expression flickered, just for a second, but Isaiah caught it. Something had changed. For the first time since stepping into this room, Isaiah felt it. Something was about to break. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Judge Robert Whitmore adjusted his position, his expression unreadable. His fingers drummed against the bench before he spoke. "Your mother was processed legally," he said, his voice measured. Isaiah did not flinch. His gaze locked onto the judge's. "Then why isn't she on any inmate list?" A murmur spread through the gallery. The defense lawyer shifted, throwing a glance at the prosecution, who sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. "There are procedures in place," the judge said, dismissing the question. "No." Isaiah's voice was steady now, stronger than before. "There are lies in place." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few reporters leaned forward, pens scratching against their notepads. The judge's gavel struck the wood with force. "Enough!" His tone was sharp, his composure beginning to crack. "This is not how legal proceedings work." Before Isaiah could respond, a voice from the back of the courtroom interrupted. "Your Honor, I request the immediate release of all detainment records." Heads turned. A lawyer, who had been silently observing, now stood. His suit crisp, his voice unwavering. He held a thick folder in his hands, his eyes narrowing on the judge. Judge Whitmore's face paled. "That won't be necessary." "Oh, but it is," the lawyer countered, stepping forward. "Because if this boy's mother isn't in the system, then someone is hiding something." A heavy silence fell over the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Isaiah saw it. The slight tremor in the judge's fingers, the quick glances exchanged between the court officers. He could feel it now. The walls were closing in. "Your Honor," the lawyer continued, his voice calm but firm, "I will be filing an immediate motion to obtain all records pertaining to Angela Reynolds' detainment. If her arrest was legitimate, there should be no issue providing that information." The judge hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Long enough for everyone in the room to see. "Court is adjourned," Whitmore announced abruptly, slamming his gavel down before anyone else could speak. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones, whispering furiously. Isaiah stood still in the chaos, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. The truth was unraveling, and it had started with him. Isaiah looked around the room, watching the expressions of those who had been so confident just moments ago. The prosecutor stood frozen, his lips pressed into a thin line. The defense lawyer flipped anxiously through his papers, as if searching for an answer that did not exist. Even the court officers, usually stoic, exchanged uneasy glances. Outside the courtroom doors, a frenzy of reporters gathered, waiting for the inevitable storm of questions. Isaiah exhaled, his hands shaking slightly. He had known this wouldn't be easy. He had known that stepping into this fight meant challenging people with power. But he hadn't expected them to look so afraid. As he turned to leave, he caught the eye of the lawyer who had spoken up for him. The man gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the battle ahead. This was far from over. Isaiah squared his shoulders and walked toward the doors, ready for whatever came next. He had already done the impossible. He had made them listen. The courtroom was in chaos. Officials hurriedly shuffled through documents, their frantic movements a stark contrast to the controlled order that had existed just minutes before. Lawyers whispered among themselves, reporters typed furiously, and the judge's gavel slammed down repeatedly in a futile attempt to restore silence. Within minutes, clerks and court officers had pulled Angela Reynolds's records. What they found sent a ripple of shock through the room. Angela had been transferred to a private detention facility. No official charges had been filed, no hearings scheduled, no legal justification. The gasps from the gallery were nearly deafening. A collective realization spread through the courtroom. This was more than a mistake. This was a cover-up. The lawyer who had demanded the records turned sharply to face the judge. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady and sharp. "This is unlawful," he declared. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Judge Whitmore's jaw tightened. His grip on the bench was like iron, but the slight shift in his expression betrayed him. "I had no part in it," he said, his voice forced and controlled. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "Then release her." His eyes bore into the judge. "Right now." The silence was suffocating. Every eye in the room was on the judge, waiting, watching. The pressure was unbearable. The walls were closing in around him, and he knew it. Judge Whitmore swallowed hard. He glanced at the prosecution table, where the lead prosecutor sat motionless, his face pale. The weight of exposure was evident in the air, thick and undeniable. Through gritted teeth, the judge gave the only order he could. Order her immediate release. The moment the words left his lips, the room erupted again. Some cheered, others scrambled to make calls. Reporters rushed toward the exit, desperate to be the first to break the news. Isaiah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had done it. He had forced them to see the truth. And that's when everything changed. The defense attorney turned to Isaiah, his eyes filled with something between admiration and disbelief. "You just did what most grown men are afraid to do," he muttered, shaking his head. "You exposed them." Isaiah barely registered the words. His mind raced, his pulse still hammering in his chest. He had fought for his mother, demanded justice, and won. But the fight was far from over. Across the room, the lead prosecutor gathered his papers in stiff, jerky movements, avoiding the gaze of the press. The bailiffs hesitated, unsure of what to do next. For the first time in that courtroom, those in power were scrambling for control. Isaiah turned toward the doors, the weight of everything pressing down on him. But for the first time in weeks, it wasn't a weight of fear or uncertainty. It was the weight of victory. As he stepped forward, the cameras flashed, reporters called his name, and the world began to listen. The system had been cracked open, and Isaiah Reynolds had done it. Isaiah stood outside the courthouse, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His heart pounded in his chest, anticipation tightening around him like a vice. Hours had passed since the judge had ordered his mother's release, but each minute felt like an eternity. The street lights flickered above, illuminating the growing crowd of reporters and bystanders who had gathered, eager to witness what would come next. Then, the heavy doors of the courthouse creaked open. Isaiah's breath hitched. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. There she was. Angela Reynolds stepped forward, thin and exhausted, but standing strong. Her eyes searched the crowd frantically until they landed on him. The moment their gazes met, everything else disappeared. "Mama!" Isaiah sprinted toward her, his feet barely touching the ground. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't care. He crashed into her arms, his small frame folding into hers as she wrapped him in the tightest embrace he had ever felt. Tears streamed down Angela's face as she ran her fingers through his hair. "Baby," she whispered, her voice breaking, "my sweet boy." Isaiah held on to her like she might disappear again. "They said you were gone," he choked out. "But I knew you wouldn't leave me." The crowd around them erupted into cheers, the flash of cameras lighting up the night like fireworks. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, voices overlapping with questions. "Angela, how does it feel to be free?" She lifted her chin, her eyes still glistening with tears. Her arms never left Isaiah as she looked out at the sea of faces before her. "It feels like justice," she said. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. The weight of those words settled over everyone, the undeniable truth of what had just happened pressing down on them all. But just as the cheers began to die down, something happened that no one expected. The courthouse doors opened again, and this time the people stepping out weren't reporters or officials. They were other detainees. A line of men and women, weary but hopeful, walked into the night, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some clutched hands, others stared at the world as if seeing it for the first time in years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "What's going on?" A young woman near the front wiped at her eyes. "They just let us go," she whispered. "No explanation, no papers, just let us go." Isaiah turned back to his mother, his heart racing again for a different reason. Angela's fingers tightened around his. "Isaiah," she said softly, a new kind of awe in her voice, "look what you've done." For the first time since it had all begun, Isaiah felt the full weight of what had happened. It hadn't just been about his mother. It had been about all of them. The morning after Angela Reynolds' release, the world had changed. News of Isaiah's bravery had spread like wildfire, flashing across television screens, headlining newspapers, and dominating social media. His name had become a symbol of resistance, his fight a rallying cry for justice. In cities across the country, protests erupted. Crowds gathered outside courthouses demanding answers. How many others had been secretly detained? How deep did the corruption go? The nation wanted justice, and they wanted it now. Inside a crowded press conference, Isaiah stood before dozens of reporters. He still felt the weight of everything that had happened, but he also felt something new: purpose. A journalist stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Isaiah, you exposed a broken system. What's next for you?" Isaiah didn't hesitate. "I want to be a lawyer," he said, "so no kid ever has to fight alone." A wave of murmurs and camera flashes followed his words. He stood tall, unwavering. Beside him, Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, her pride shining through her exhaustion. "And I'll be right there with you," she said, her voice firm, "every step of the way." Meanwhile, the fallout from the case was swift. The judge who had denied Angela her rights, Robert Whitmore, was removed from his position. Investigations into his rulings were launched immediately, and the results were damning. Case after case of wrongful imprisonment, evidence tampering, and racial bias came to light. The Department of Justice announced a full inquiry into private detention facilities, and more names of people like Angela, began to surface. Families reunited, stories were told, and the voices of the forgotten were finally heard. But for Isaiah, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the investigations. It was in the people he had helped, the ones who had walked free that night, the ones who now had a second chance. As he and his mother walked home together, away from the flashing cameras and the noise, Isaiah looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the city, a city he had changed forever. Angela squeezed his hand. "You did something incredible," she said. Isaiah shook his head. We did. That night, as Isaiah lay in bed, he replayed everything that had happened. Stop. The fear, the anger, the fight. The faces of the people he had helped. The ones who still needed justice. This wasn't the end of the road. It was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Isaiah received letters from across the country. Strangers who had heard his story, who had been inspired by his courage. Some were children like him, others were adults who had fought similar battles. Each message reminded him that his voice had made a difference. One letter stood out. It was from a man who had spent years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. He wrote about how Isaiah's fight had given him hope, how he had almost given up believing in justice. Isaiah held the letter tightly, his resolve strengthening. He had fought for his mother, but the fight wasn't over. His battle had been won that day. But in the end, he had started something much bigger, a revolution.